up there.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
My eyesight is not as good as it used to be, but that looks like the constellation that we have.
Are you going to launch any new satellites that can give us even more accurate measurements on how much carbon dioxide and other gases are in the atmosphere?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing to remember, although we've been doing space-based observations, we just celebrated the 40th year of the first observations of the Earth from space. But in fact, this constellation that we have now studying the Earth system is relatively new. Really, the major instruments that we've been using are only about 10 years old. And most of them, we've got 14 operating satellites up there now. Most of them are beyond their design lifetime. And so we are right now in the process, and in fact, the administration has put the budget into NASA to essentially refurbish, but not only refurbish, but really identify those priority measurements that we need to make, and then use the latest technologies to make those observations.
Are those priorities carbon dioxide?
Absolutely. For those that have tracked what NASA does, know that our first satellite to look at CO2 in space, the Orbiting Carbon Observatory, or OCO, unfortunately we lost that on launch in January 2009. But we are in the throes of rebuilding that instrument, and we're getting ready to launch that in a couple of years. So we're hoping to have the first, well, the Japanese also are making similar measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
The new satellite, will that tell us more precisely or at all where the carbon is coming from and the other methanes and the other?
Well, clearly that's a big issue, is really tracking the global carbon budget. And so one of the important things is to know, globally, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere at any one time. And so it will be an important first step to get those measurements so that we can, for the first time, really put the boundary on what the real atmospheric composition is.
Okay, my image of NASA is starting to change, and I'm starting to get a feeling, a sense that you folks are really focusing on what matters. Our environment and the species, etc. I do want to ask a question about you. You mentioned one attribute of climate change, and that is it heats up the planet, okay? And I can imagine, what the heat means to some extent. But what does it do to the cycles that are in our nature for various species? And maybe you can bring it to us at some point.
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that although NASA does have this major scientific effort to understand the Earth, it's such a complex problem that we don't do that in a vacuum. So we work very closely with other agencies and the academic world. But in terms of what's going on now, I mean, climate change is just part of the Earth's existence. But what's going on now is, what looks like much more rapid climate change. And so, just looking at human population, we've built most of our infrastructure near the coastlines. One thing that's going to happen is that sea level is going to rise, and there could be a huge disruption in just our infrastructure where people live, and what we might have to do about that.
Steve Schneider's wife, Terry Root, has often been out speaking about how the birds and what they eat, how the cycle has changed. The birds arrive when the fish aren't here or whatever, and the species, these lower level species, can't react, and that's because of climate change. What can you say about how the cycles are changing and how you and I, your family and mine, will have to react in the future?
Well, it's a little bit like the frogs in the boiling water. It's a slow enough process that it doesn't just sort of happen immediately. I mean, when we say rapid climate change, we're talking decades to 50 to 100 years. But what happens is that for example, precipitation in California. The expectation is that there will be less snowfall and more rainfall. And what that does is it causes the biosphere, the blooms, to happen earlier in the season. And so, you may have birds that depend on a certain species that bloom at a certain time because the vegetation is blooming. But if that blooming comes much before they're ready to come, on their migration from the north, this bloom may die off before they're there. And so you have this disconnect between, what happens immediately, say in relation to how precipitation changes, versus the natural migration patterns of other animals that are based on the different seasons. So you just get a mismatch between predator and prey, for example, and if the prey is not there when the predator needs it, they have problems.
And how do the change in cycles, the speeding up and how's it going to impact us?
Well, certainly there's a lot of research right now. One of the big issues, for example, is does warming speed up the normal water cycle on the planet? And that water cycle consists of these big storms, hurricanes in the Atlantic, for example. And one of the big controversies right now is whether the increasing intensity of these hurricanes can be directly related to climate change and particularly warming. I think the jury is still out on that one. There seems to be a lot of evidence, but not the direct smoking gun.
All right. Earlier you talked about the pole and the ice melt to an extent, and we have a photo, and you folks have made a lot of observations about what's happening in the North Pole, okay? And I was wondering, could we bring up this? Could you explain this?
Absolutely. That's one of probably the iconic image of how you can diagnose that the planet is warming. The Arctic ice sheet typically lasts from year to year, but what we've seen over the last several years is that most of that ice sheet is melting in the summertime, and much more rapidly than any of the models that we had predicted. And one of the things that happens is you get these positive feedbacks, and so as you melt the ice is a lot more reflective than the seawater, and so when the sun is hitting the ice, much of that gets reflected out to space. As you melt the ice, the sun hits the ocean and gets absorbed, warming the ocean more, melting the ice more. So you get this positive feedback that actually exacerbates or speeds up the process of the ice melting.
Is the North Pole, as we know it, or have known it, is it really already gone, in effect? Can we write it off?
Well, for the first time, you've seen areas of sea passages that have never been opened up before. Again, climate change is an issue of looking at things for decades to centuries, and so it really is hard to predict. Certainly every evidence suggests that we're heading for a period of no ice in the Arctic. But again, the jury's a bit still out on that as to when that will occur.
Well, I think it's great that you folks are really studying the planet. And I know you learned a lot in space. And I hear you're building a new building. And I'm just wondering how sustainable, how you folks are really applying what you have learned in space to make buildings that are good for civilization right now.
Yeah, well, glad you asked that question, Michael. So we are building a new building. So it's actually the first building that we've built down at NASA Ames for 25 years. And we decided at NASA Ames that we didn't want to just simply build yet another government building. We wanted to really see what we could do. So understanding the concerns about the environment and looking at all of our technologies, we basically decided to build what we hope will be the greenest building in the federal government. We actually call it sustainability base because we want to show that we're using those NASA technologies that have taken us to space, and we're applying those to sustainability here on Earth.
Will you let the public come in and see this?
Oh, absolutely. We're very excited about that. We're planning to have a grand opening in May of this coming year, but we definitely will look to this building as a showcase of what we do at NASA Ames.
All right. And can you just tell us one thing special that you folks have applied to make this a zero or a net energy consuming?
Yeah, so we are planning for it to be zero net energy. We're putting solar panels on the roofs. We're not going to have a standard HVAC system, so we're using geothermal wells to do heat exchange with the deeper ground. So that will be our heating and cooling. We've made the buildings very narrow so that we will bring in natural light, so we'll minimize the amount of artificial light that we'll need in the building. But one of the technologies that we're directly applying from the NASA space program is water treatment, and taking the wastewater and purifying it much the way we do on space missions, and being able to reuse that water.
All right. You've been a wonderful guest. My guest has been Steve Hipskind. He is the head of Earth Science Division at NASA Ames in Mountain View, California. And he has helped convince me that NASA has a great focus on studying what is happening on this planet, and I think all of this information is extremely valuable to us. And now I want to mention again that starting almost immediately, the art exhibition, Climate Change, dedicated to Stephen Schneider, opens at the Palo Alto City Hall, and I hope everyone has a chance to see it. Thank you. I'm Michael Killen.